January 7th, 1942. Deep in his East Prussia headquarters, Adolf Hitler delivered a judgment about America that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. He saw no future for the Americans, he told his inner circle. A rotting nation, racial problems, social chaos, half their society corrupted by Jewish influence, the other half degraded by African blood. How could anyone expect a country like that to hold together? 7,000 miles away, in a cramped Richmond, California shipyard office, 57-year-old Henry Kaiser was sketching on hotel notepaper. He'd never built a ship in his life. Dams, roads, bridges, plenty of those. But ships were complicated. Established shipbuilders said it took 8 months to build a cargo vessel. Kaiser looked at his sketch and told his team they'd build one in 4 days. Hitler believed Americans were weak. Kaiser was about to prove him spectacularly wrong. The mistake started long before the first bomb dropped. German military intelligence assembled thick reports on American industrial strength, military readiness, and national character. The conclusions were remarkably consistent. America was a nation of shopkeepers and consumers, not warriors. Its army in '39 ranked among the world's smallest, smaller than Portugal's. Its factories churned out cars and refrigerators, not tanks and warplanes. Its people had grown comfortable, with zero appetite for sacrifice. When Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft annually, German high command laughed it off as fantasy. In '39, American military aircraft production had barely cracked 3,000 planes. The notion this could multiply by nearly 20 seemed ridiculous. Hermann Goering shared his leader's contempt completely. He'd built the Luftwaffe from nothing into Europe's most feared military aviation force. He understood what it took to produce modern combat aircraft: the precision engineering, the specialized alloys, the trained workforce, the years of experience. America had none of these. The idea they could conjure an air force out of automobile factories struck him as laughable. The German generals had faced Americans before in the Great War's final year. American troops had performed adequately but showed up late, suffered light casualties compared to European powers, and contributed little to strategic direction. Those memories reinforced the belief that Americans lacked the hardness required for sustained combat. Albert Speer, Hitler's later armaments minister, sat in on many dinner conversations about America. Hitler believed Americans hadn't played any prominent role in 14 to 18. They hadn't made serious blood sacrifices. They certainly couldn't withstand a trial by fire. In general, Hitler insisted, no American people even existed as a unified entity, just a mass of immigrants from countless nations and races. This racial analysis sat at Hitler's worldview's core. He believed national strength flowed from racial purity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed inherent superiority. America, a mongrel nation, couldn't possibly match German martial spirit. But the German analysis contained a fatal flaw. They measured American potential by peacetime performance. They saw a nation that hadn't mobilized and concluded it couldn't. They saw factories making consumer goods and assumed those factories couldn't pivot to weapons. They saw diversity and believed it automatically meant weakness. They were catastrophically wrong. The transformation kicked off before America officially entered the war. Summer of '40, with France fallen and Britain under siege, Roosevelt challenged American industry to perform a miracle of production. Auto factories would stop making cars. Appliance plants would stop making refrigerators. Every lathe, every press, every assembly line would convert to war production, a fundamental restructuring of the entire American economy. In '41, over 3 million automobiles rolled off American lines. Over the next 4 years, only 139 more would be built. The entire automotive industry pivoted to weapons. Chrysler made fuselages. GM cranked out engines, guns, trucks, tanks. Packard produced Rolls-Royce engines for the RAF. Companies that had never made anything more dangerous than kitchen appliances learned to produce ammunition. The conversion happened fast because American industry possessed capabilities Germans never understood. The key was standardization and interchangeable parts. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques, allowing different facilities to manufacture components that fit together perfectly. A carburetor made in Ohio would fit an engine from Michigan, powering a vehicle assembled in California. This system, developed over decades for civilian production, was now applied to weapons of war. Skeptics insisted it couldn't be done. Aircraft weren't automobiles. You couldn't stamp out a bomber like a Ford. The tolerances were too precise. The systems too complex. A single heavy bomber contained over 1 million parts. An automobile had 15,000. Henry Kaiser ignored every skeptic. In December 40, he won a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British. No shipyard. Zero shipbuilding experience. No trained workers. What he had was a system. The system was everything. Kaiser didn't think about shipbuilding like traditional shipbuilders. He treated it as a manufacturing problem. The specific product mattered less than the process. Every manufacturing process could be analyzed, broken into components, optimized, and scaled. Traditional shipbuilders learned through apprenticeship. A skilled riveter might spend years learning. Kaiser didn't have years. He had months. So he designed processes learnable in days, substituting machinery for labor wherever possible. Established shipbuilders said it would never work. Ships were too complex, the ocean too unforgiving. Vessels built by amateurs would sink. Kaiser proved them wrong. His ships were built faster and better. The defect rate at Kaiser's yards ran less than half that of conventional shipyards. The same systematic approach that accelerated production also improved quality. Kaiser applied the same principles that had built Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He broke shipbuilding into modules, prefabricating entire sections and assembling them like building blocks. He used welding instead of riveting, faster and requiring less skilled labor. He recruited workers nationwide, built housing, established childcare, created healthcare systems. The transformation of ordinary Americans into shipbuilders defied conventional wisdom. Men and women who'd never seen the ocean, never held a welding torch, learned to build ships in weeks. Kaiser's training was ruthlessly efficient. A new worker could become a competent welder in 10 days, a productive team member in 30. Workers came from everywhere. Oklahoma farmers who'd lost land to drought. Detroit factory workers laid off during Depression. Women who'd never worked outside the home. African Americans seeking opportunities denied in the segregated South. The Richmond Yards workforce eventually peaked at over 90,000, nearly a third women. In 41, average time to build a Liberty ship was 230 days. By 42, Kaiser's yards had reduced that to 45 days, then 30, then 20. In November 42, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard built the Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours. From keel laying to launch took less time than a U-boat needed to cross the Atlantic. The Germans now faced an unanticipated strategic crisis. Admiral Karl Dönitz had staked everything on a simple calculation. His submarines would sink Allied shipping faster than replacement. In early 42, this appeared to work. German U-boats prowled the American East Coast during the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of merchant ships within sight of shore. Through the first 6 months of 42, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. Catastrophic losses. But even as U-boats chalked up kills, the shipyards accelerated. In 42, American yards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. In 43, 19 million tons. By fall 43, new construction exceeded losses for the first time. Every ship the U-boat sank was replaced by 2 more. Dönitz watched the numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were sinking ships at a rate that would have won the First World War. But this wasn't the First World War. This was a conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity defied comprehension. The math was merciless. Donitz calculated his U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping monthly to strangle Britain. In 42, they came close. But by 43, American shipyards alone were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The target kept moving, always receding, always beyond reach. What happened at sea was replicated in the air. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit became the symbol of American industrial might. Designed by famed industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility covered 3.5 million square feet, the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. Its purpose was to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber more complex than anything Ford had ever manufactured. The challenges were immense. The B-24 had over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It required precision engineering the automobile industry had never attempted. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied aircraft manufacturer Consolidated's methods and found them primitive. Bombers were being assembled outdoors by hand, using techniques unchanged for decades. Sorensen proposed something revolutionary. He'd build bombers on a moving assembly line, just like automobiles. Critics called the idea insane. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed that you couldn't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. Ford struggled initially. The government kept changing the aircraft's design, which disrupted the assembly line. Workers had to learn entirely new skills. Instead of Willow Run, Senator Harry Truman investigated the delays and publicly questioned whether Ford could deliver on its promises. Ford's response was characteristically stubborn. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting Consolidated's hand-drawn sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. They produced 5 miles of technical drawings per day. When Consolidated modifications made drawings obsolete before they could be implemented, Ford engineers started over without complaint. By 44, the problems were solved. Willow Run produced 1 B-24 every 63 minutes. At peak production in April 44, the plant turned out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24th and 26th of that year, 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in just 72 hours. The Army Air Forces eventually had to tell Ford to slow down. They had no place to park all the aircraft. Storage areas at training bases overflowed with B-24s waiting for crews. The production capacity exceeded the military's ability to deploy the aircraft. Meanwhile, American aircraft production overall reached numbers the German High Command had declared impossible. In 44 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft. That single year's production exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft between 40 and 45, roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The scale defied comprehension. At peak, American industry was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany had possessed at the war's start. The assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts changed at midnight and noon. The factories never stopped. The Germans faced the consequences of their misjudgment in the skies over Europe. Their pilots were among the world's best trained. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, were formidable machines. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed their American counterparts, but attrition was relentless. For every German aircraft shot down, the Americans could produce 3 more. For every experienced German pilot killed, the Americans could train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an enemy who could absorb losses and keep coming. The German misjudgment extended beyond industry to the fighting quality of American soldiers themselves. In February 43, American ground forces met the German army in combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result appeared to confirm every German prejudice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps tore through inexperienced American positions. Units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control collapsed. American casualties exceeded 6,000. Some German officers who dismissed Americans as soft now had battlefield evidence supporting their contempt. The Americans at Kasserine were green in ways only combat could reveal. Many soldiers had never fired their weapons in anger. Officers who'd trained for years in peacetime conditions found themselves unable to function under fire. But Rommel was too good a general to let initial impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He watched what happened after Kasserine, and what he saw troubled him. The Americans recovered with startling speed. Within weeks of the disaster, they reorganized their forces, relieved incompetent commanders, implemented brutal lessons learned. General George Patton took command of the demoralized Second Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. Patton was a force of nature. He descended on Second Corps like a thunderstorm, demanding discipline, punishing sloppiness, driving his men to standards they'd never met. Soldiers who'd slouched through the Kasserine disaster found themselves polishing brass, standing at attention, training harder than they'd ever trained. But Patton did more than impose discipline. He studied why the Americans had failed and implemented specific corrections. The American military possessed an institutional commitment to learning from failure that the Germans failed to recognize. After Kasserine, the Army's ground forces commander conducted a comprehensive review of what went wrong. His findings were sent back to training camps across the United States, where they shaped preparation of divisions that hadn't yet deployed. The mistakes of February 43 became the curriculum of March 43. Rommel later recorded his observations. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class, he wrote. They'd recovered very quickly after the first shock, and soon succeeded in damming up our advance. Unlike many German generals, Rommel didn't make the mistake of underestimating how fast Americans learned from failures. By May 43, 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner-of-war cages, more than had surrendered at Stalingrad. The Americans who'd panicked at Kasserine were now among the victors. The speed of American recovery shocked German commanders who'd expected a longer period of demoralization. The pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces stumbled initially, learned rapidly, improved continuously. The same troops who'd fled from German tanks in Tunisia would storm the beaches of Normandy and fight their way across France. The same pilots who'd been outmaneuvered by experienced Luftwaffe veterans would eventually sweep the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was built into American institutions. The Army maintained a continuous feedback loop between combat units and training establishments. After-action reports from the front were analyzed within weeks and incorporated into revised training programs. Doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. German military culture, by contrast, had calcified around fixed doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged. Failure was often fatal to careers. The same rigidity that had produced brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances changed. Hitler made this rigidity worse. He interfered constantly in military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer was career-ending at best, and potentially fatal. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. When D-Day came in June 44, German commanders in France were surprised by the invasion force's scale. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics required to move this force across the English Channel and supply it on hostile shores represented an organizational achievement German planners had considered impossible. The American role was overwhelming. The equipment supporting the assault, landing craft, transport aircraft, tanks and trucks that moved inland from the beaches, came largely from American factories. The ships that bombarded German positions were built in American yards. The aircraft that dominated the skies were produced on American assembly lines. German defenders fought with characteristic tenacity. In some sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material the Allies brought to bear. When an American infantry company encountered a defended position, they called for artillery support. The artillery fire that followed wasn't a few rounds. It was hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells falling in concentrated barrages that pulverized defensive positions. The Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that multiplied their combat power. German soldiers who'd fought on the Eastern Front said American warfare style was different from Soviet tactics. The Soviets threw men at problems. The Americans threw machines. The outcome was similar. Overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the human cost to Americans was lower. Hitler's misjudgment had consequences that rippled through every level of German strategy. Because he believed America wouldn't intervene effectively, he declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, bringing into the conflict an enemy he didn't need to fight. Because he believed American industry couldn't deliver on its promises, he allowed the U-boat campaign to continue long after it had ceased being strategically viable. Because he believed American soldiers were soft, he failed to reinforce the Western Front adequately until too late. The declaration of war on America in December 41 remains one of the 20th century's most inexplicable strategic decisions. Germany wasn't obligated to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement required mutual defense only if one partner was attacked, not if one partner attacked others. Hitler could have remained neutral toward America while Japan fought in the Pacific. But Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More importantly, he didn't believe America mattered. A nation of racial mongrels divided by class and corrupted by Jewish influence couldn't possibly affect the war's outcome. This contempt shaped German strategy throughout the conflict. Resources that might have strengthened the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere because the American industrial threat wasn't taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have bolstered North African defenses were sent to the Eastern Front because the Mediterranean was considered secondary. Preparations for an Allied invasion were inadequate because the scale of American power wasn't understood. By 44, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts, with resources barely adequate for one. The Eastern Front consumed most of Germany's military strength. The Mediterranean theater drained divisions that might have defended France. And the bombing campaign, conducted largely by American aircraft, devastated German industry and cities. Hermann Göring, who'd dismissed American production claims as fantasy, lived to see his air force destroyed by the very industrial might he'd mocked. After the war, in a prison interview, he admitted that the tempo of American shipbuilding, particularly Henry Kaiser's program, had surprised and upset German planners. Claims of building ships in 8 to 10 days had seemed fantastic. They weren't fantastic. They were true. By spring of 45, the 1,000-year Reich was collapsing. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies closed in from the east. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing that the Luftwaffe was powerless to stop. The factories that had produced Wehrmacht weapons were rubble. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 45, still convinced his analysis had been correct. If Germany had lost, it was because the German people had failed him, because his generals had betrayed him, because fate had conspired against him. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about America had been wrong. The nation he'd dismissed as racially inferior and industrially incapable had crushed his armies. The evidence was undeniable. The nation he'd called decayed had outproduced Germany by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The people he'd labeled soft had fought with determination and ferocity across 2 oceans. The industrial capacity he'd mocked as propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of steel and explosives. The statistics told the story. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks. The numbers weren't propaganda. They were reality. Henry Kaiser didn't become a household name after the war. He returned to private industry, eventually building hospitals, automobiles, housing developments. The shipyards that had launched a vessel every few days were dismantled or converted to peacetime production. The workers who'd achieved what established experts said was impossible went back to ordinary jobs. The Willow Run plant, which had produced more bombers than Germany could shoot down, was sold to other manufacturers. For decades, it made automobiles instead of aircraft. By the time General Motors closed the facility in 2010, few remembered what had happened there during the war. The men and women who'd built the arsenal of democracy scattered back to their ordinary lives. The welders returned to farms and factories. The riveters became housewives and teachers. The workers who'd achieved production miracles that German intelligence dismissed as impossible faded into anonymity. But the lesson of what they accomplished shouldn't be forgotten. The German misjudgment of America wasn't simply an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. German leadership looked at America and saw what they expected to see. A soft, divided, undisciplined nation, unsuited for war. They didn't see what actually existed. A sleeping giant with industrial capacity, organizational talent, and human determination that would prove unstoppable once awakened. The factories that built Liberty ships and B-24 bombers have mostly been demolished. The workers who staffed them have passed into history. The war they helped win ended 8 decades ago. But the story matters because misjudgment still costs lives. Nations still underestimate their adversaries. Leaders still confuse their assumptions with reality. The German High Command believed what it wanted to believe about America. And that belief led to catastrophic miscalculation. German strategists began with their conclusions and worked backward to find evidence supporting them. They noted American unpreparedness in '39 and concluded Americans couldn't prepare. They observed American diversity and concluded Americans couldn't unify. They saw American comfort and concluded Americans couldn't sacrifice. Each conclusion was wrong. Americans prepared faster than anyone believed possible. Americans unified around the war effort with remarkable solidarity. Americans sacrificed in ways that would have seemed unthinkable before Pearl Harbor. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The generals and admirals who dismissed American production figures as propaganda, who scoffed at American fighting quality, who believed material abundance couldn't compensate for German martial tradition, these weren't stupid men. They were capable professionals who let preconceptions override evidence. They saw an America they recognized from their assumptions and ignored the America that actually existed. The industrial might that crushed Nazi Germany didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from shipyard workers in Richmond who stayed on the job around the clock. From assembly line workers at Willow Run who built aircraft faster than anyone believed possible. From farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who put on uniforms and learned to fight. These weren't supermen. They were simply ordinary people who did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The housewives who became welders had never imagined themselves working in factories. The farmers who became soldiers had never imagined themselves crossing oceans to fight. They did these things anyway. They learned skills they'd never possessed. They endured hardships they'd never anticipated. They achieved feats experts said were impossible. And when the war was over, most of them went back to ordinary lives and never spoke much about what they'd done. The German misjudgment was ultimately a failure to understand human potential. Hitler looked at Americans and saw their limitations. He didn't see their capacity for growth, for adaptation, for rising to challenges that seemed insurmountable. He mistook the America of peacetime for the America that would emerge under pressure. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Nations aren't fixed quantities. Societies aren't static. The capabilities that exist in peacetime aren't necessarily the limits of what's possible in war. A country that seems weak in one moment can become strong in the next if its people have the will and organizational capacity to mobilize. Hitler looked at America and saw a decayed country that couldn't hold together. He was looking at the wrong America. The America that mattered wasn't the America of his prejudices. It was the America that built ships in days and bombers in hours, that took raw recruits and turned them into combat soldiers in months, that absorbed defeats, learned from them, and came back stronger. That America, the real America, was messy and chaotic and inefficient by German standards, but it won.